The year was 1881, and the wind that swept across the high plains of the territory was a liar. It promised coolness that never came, only delivering a finer, more insidious dust that coated everything in a gritty film of pale brown. It coated the raw timber of the town of Redemption, it coated the listless leaves of the cottonwoods by the creek, and it coated the memory of Cora Prescott's life, burying it under a layer of shame so thick she thought she might choke on it. Her hair, or what was left of it, was the town's most public proclamation of her guilt. They had held her down in the dusty street, the faces of her neighbors twisted into masks of righteous fury. Preacher Amos had wielded the shears himself, his knuckles white, his voice booming about devilry and unnatural women as the locks of her dark hair fell around her like dead things. They called her a witch because her husband, Walter, and her little girl, Rose, had succumbed to the lung fever while the preacher's own family had been spared. They called her a witch because she knew which roots eased a cough and which poultice drew out infection, knowledge passed down from her grandmother that had suddenly become evidence of a pact with darkness. The shearing had been 2 months ago. Now her scalp prickled under the relentless sun, a constant, humiliating reminder of her ostracization. She lived at the very edge of Redemption, in the small, sturdy cabin Walter had built with his own hands. It was her prison and her only sanctuary. The town had not driven her out completely, but they had walled her off with their fear and suspicion. When she walked the single street for meager supplies, a path of silence cleared before her. Mothers pulled their children close. Men stared with a mixture of contempt and a strange, unwelcome curiosity. Her grief was a private country, but her shame was a public spectacle. Her days fell into a brittle, monotonous rhythm. She rose with the sun, the first light painting the eastern sky in bruises of purple and rose. She worked the small garden behind the cabin, coaxing stubborn life from the parched soil. She scrubbed, mended, and maintained the home that felt more like a tomb, a monument to a life that had ended long before her heart had stopped beating. In the afternoons, she would walk to the 2 small mounds of earth under the lone pine tree 100 yards from her door. She never wept. The tears had dried up with the creek bed, leaving only a cracked and barren landscape inside her. She would sit there, her hand resting on the packed dirt, and feel nothing but a hollow echo where love used to be. This afternoon was no different. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the land. She had been foraging for what little wild onion and hardy greens survived along the dry creek, her basket mostly empty. As she turned back toward the cabin, a flicker of movement near the cluster of sun-bleached boulders at the base of the ridge caught her eye. It was not the familiar scuttle of a lizard or the flight of a startled bird. It was larger, something slumped and unnatural. Caution was a lesson the world had taught her well. Her first instinct was to retreat, to bolt the door of her cabin and pretend she had seen nothing. The people of Redemption feared 2 things above all: God's wrath, which they saw in every shadow, and the Apache, who they spoke of in hushed, terrified tones as ghosts of the wilderness. To be found near one was a death sentence of a different kind. But something held her rooted to the spot, a stillness in the shape, a finality that spoke of injury, not ambush. She stood for a long time, the sun burning her neck, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Slowly, drawn by a force she could not name, perhaps the ghost of the healer they had condemned her for being, she moved closer. He was lying face down, half in the shade of an overhang, an Apache man judged by his hide leggings and the beaded armband visible on his upper arm. His back was a nightmare of torn flesh and dried blood, as if he had been mauled by a great cat. A long, ugly gash ran down his leg, caked with dirt and blackening at the edges. One hand was curled near a fallen canteen, the other stretched out as if reaching for a destination he would never find. He was utterly still. She thought he was dead. As she drew within a few feet, a shudder racked his body. A low groan, more an exhalation of pure agony than a sound, escaped his lips. He was alive. Her mind screamed at her, "Run. Leave him. This is not your concern." This is a danger you cannot afford. The town, Preacher Amos, the shears glinting in the sunit, all flashed before her eyes. Bringing an Apache, an enemy in the eyes of everyone she knew, into her home was an act of madness. It was an invitation for the final, absolute destruction of her life. And yet, she looked at the raw wounds, at the way the flies were already gathering, at the desperate, shallow breaths that barely stirred his chest. She saw not a warrior, not a threat, but a dying man, and in the vast, empty desert of her own soul, a single, stubborn seed of compassion stirred. It was the part of her they had tried to cut out with the shears, the part they had tried to burn away with their accusations. It was the part of her that was still a wife, a mother, a woman who knew the face of suffering because she lived with it every day. With a gasp that was half sob, half resolve, she made her choice. She dropped her basket and knelt beside him. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. It took all her strength, her hands slipping in the slick, warm blood that had soaked his deerskin shirt, to turn him over. His face was stark and angular, streaked with dirt and pain, his eyes closed. His lips were cracked and grey. Getting him to the cabin was a trial of fire. She dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, her own muscles screaming in protest. The sun beat down, and sweat stung her eyes. He was a dead weight, unconscious, his body a testament to the brutality of the land. Twice she had to stop, her lungs burning, convinced she could not go on. But each time she would look at his still face, and then toward the two graves under the pine, and a grim, relentless energy would surge through her. She had failed to save her own. She would not fail this stranger. She finally got him inside, the cool dimness of the cabin a shocking relief. She dragged him onto the braided rug before the cold hearth, his body leaving a grim trail across her floorboards. She stood over him, panting, her dress stained with his blood, her hands trembling. The silence of the room was immense, broken only by their labored breathing. She had crossed a line. There was no going back. Outside, the world of redemption and its judgment felt 1,000,000 miles away. Inside, in the shadowed quiet, a new world had just begun, fraught with a danger and a possibility she could not yet comprehend. The first day and night were a blur of focused, desperate work. Cora moved with an efficiency born of old practice and new urgency. First, water. She fetched a bucket from the well, the rope groaning in protest. With a clean rag, she gently wiped the grime and dried blood from his face, revealing high cheekbones and a strong jaw clenched even in unconsciousness. His skin was hot to the touch, the fever already taking hold. She turned her attention to the wounds. The deep gouges on his back were inflamed and angry. The gash on his leg was worse, the flesh around it swollen and dark. Infection was setting in. Without cleaning and care, the fever would consume him. For a moment, a wave of helplessness washed over her. But then she went to the small wooden chest where she kept her remedies, the very things that had damned her. Her hands, which had trembled with fear, were steady now. She crushed yarrow to staunch the bleeding and boiled willow bark for the pain and fever. She prepared a poultice of mashed comfrey root and plantain leaves, a potent combination to draw out poison and fight putrefaction. As she worked, she murmured the old instructions her grandmother had taught her, the words a comforting litany in the silent cabin. The world could call it witchcraft, she knew it only as healing. Cleaning the wounds was an intimate, harrowing task. She had to cut away the torn fabric of his shirt and leggings. His body was lean and powerful, now rendered completely vulnerable. Every touch of the wet cloth to his broken skin made him flinch or groan, his body fighting even when his mind was absent. She worked meticulously, her movements gentle but firm, flushing the dirt from the lacerations, her stomach churning at the sight of the damage. When she finally applied the poultice, covering it with clean strips of linen torn from her own spare petticoat, a small sigh of relief escaped her. She had done all she could. Now, it was up to his body's strength and the will of whatever God watched over men like him. She managed to trickle some of the willow bark tea between his cracked lips. Most of it ran down his chin, but some went down. Throughout the night, she sat by his side on a low stool, replacing the cool cloths on his forehead, listening to the strained rasp of his breathing. The single candle cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. In the flickering light, his face was a landscape of sharp angles and unfamiliar lines. He was the enemy, the savage from the stories whispered in town. But here, in the quiet intimacy of her home, he was just a man, fragile and fighting for his life. She saw not an Apache, but the universal agony of a body in revolt. He woke on the third day. She was changing the poultice on his leg when his eyes snapped open. They were not dark brown, as she had expected, but a startlingly clear black, deep and intelligent. They fixed on her instantly, not with confusion, but with a sharp, assessing clarity that made her freeze, her hand hovering over his wound. There was no fear in his gaze, only a taut, wary stillness. His eyes traveled from her face, to her hands, to the bowl of poultice beside her, then back to her face. He noted the crude, shorn state of her hair. A flicker of something not pity, but a kind of questioning recognition passed through his expression before being suppressed. Cora slowly lowered her hand and finished applying the fresh dressing. She did not speak. What was there to say? Her actions had to speak for her. She had saved his life, but she was still a white woman, a member of the people who had likely stolen his land and killed his kin. And he was an Apache, the embodiment of the terror that haunted the edges of her world. The silence in the cabin stretched, thick with unspoken history and mutual suspicion. He tried to sit up, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his lips as his back muscles protested. He fell back against the pallet she had made for him, his jaw tight. "Be still," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "You will tear the wounds open again." He did not seem to understand the words, but he understood the intent. He watched her with that same unnerving intensity as she offered him a cup of water. He hesitated for a long moment, his gaze searching hers for any sign of deceit. Finally, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached out and took the cup. His hand was steady, despite his weakness. He drank deeply, his eyes never leaving hers. Their days settled into a new, strange routine, a pantomime of guarded coexistence. She would tend his wounds in the morning and evening. He would accept her care with a stoic silence, his gaze following her every move as she went about her chores. Communication was a language of gestures, a nod of his head toward the water bucket when he was thirsty, a slight shake of her head when he tried to stand too soon. She spoke to him sometimes, not because she thought he understood, but because the silence in the cabin was a living thing, heavy with the ghosts of her husband and child. She told him about the garden, about the way the beans were struggling in the heat. She told him about Rose's favorite doll, still sitting on the small shelf by the window. She spoke of her grief in simple, declarative sentences, the words falling into the space between them, unjudged and unburdened. He listened. She knew he did. He would watch her mouth, his expression unreadable, but his attention absolute. He was a creature of profound stillness, of observation. He learned the rhythm of her sorrow. He saw the way her shoulders slumped when she thought he was not looking. He saw her stand for long moments by the door, staring out at the two graves under the pine, her face a mask of stone. As his strength began to return, the dynamic shifted. One morning she came back inside from the well, struggling with two heavy buckets of water. Before she could set them down, he was on his feet, his movements stiff with pain. He took one of the buckets from her, his face impassive, and carried it to the wash basin. He did not look at her, but the action was a clear statement. He was no longer just a patient. Soon he began to contribute in small ways. He would sit by the door for hours, painstakingly repairing a broken strap on his moccasin with a bone needle she had given him. He carved a new handle for her garden hoe from a piece of scrap wood, his knife moving with an economy and skill that fascinated her. He was reclaiming his agency piece by piece. One afternoon he walked, limping heavily, to the window and looked out. He stood for a long time, his gaze fixed on the two graves. When he turned back to her, his face held a new softness, a flicker of understanding that transcended the barrier of language. He knew what those mounds of earth meant. He tapped his own chest, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement. In that single moment, Cora felt a crack appear in the wall of her isolation. She was not just a strange, shorn woman to him anymore. He saw her loss. The suspicion between them began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, dissolve, replaced by a tentative, fragile trust. It was a trust built not on words but on shared silence, on the mutual recognition of pain, and on the simple, repeated acts of care and quiet contribution. She had taken him in to save his life, an act of defiant compassion, but in the slow, watchful days that followed, she began to realize he was, in his own silent way, saving hers as well. He was a presence in the crushing emptiness, a witness to her existence. The silence was no longer empty, it was shared. And for the first time in a very long time, Cora Prescott did not feel entirely alone. One evening, as the sky bruised into nightfall, she found him sitting by the cold hearth, etching a pattern into a small, smooth stone with the tip of his knife. The focused attention he gave the task was absolute. She brought him his mealer, simple stew of rabbit and root vegetable and set it down beside him. He paused, looking from the bowl to her, and then gestured for her to sit. It was a departure from their silent ritual. Usually, she ate at the small table while he took his meal on his pallet. Hesitantly, she retrieved her own bowl and sat on the floor across the hearth from him. They ate in the growing twilight, the only sounds the scrape of their spoons against the pottery. When he was finished, he set his bowl aside and held up the stone. He had carved the image of a hawk in flight, its wings spread wide. It was a simple, powerful design, imbued with a life that seemed impossible from mere scratches on a rock. He held it out to her. "For me?" she asked, her voice quiet. He gave a short, affirmative nod. She took the stone, its surface still warm from his hand. It felt solid, real, a gift. It had been so long since anyone had given her anything but scorn. A knot of emotion tightened in her throat. He spoke then, his voice low and gravelly, unused for days. "Kuruk." He tapped his own chest. Cora's breath hitched. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just a patient or a presence, but a person with a name. "Kuruk," she repeated softly. The name felt strange and resonant on her tongue. She pointed to herself. "Cora." "Cora," he echoed. His pronunciation was careful, the sound shaped with an unfamiliar accent, but it was her name. Hearing it spoken without contempt, without the weight of judgment, was like a balm on a raw wound. This exchange, simple as it was, changed everything. They were no longer just the wounded man and the outcast woman. They were Kuruk and Cora. The names hung in the air between them, a bridge built across a chasm of culture and experience. In the following days, the thaw between them hastened. He began to speak more, single words of Apache that she slowly began to understand through context and repetition. Haza for sleep, Tu for water. Gozhao for good, a word he used once when tasting her stew, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. She, in turn, named things for him in English. Spoon, bowl, fire. Rain. It became a quiet game, a lesson exchanged in the sanctuary of the cabin. He learned of her past not through a full telling, but through fragments and observations. He saw the faded imprint of a small hand on the dusty window pane that she could never bring herself to wipe away. He watched as she traced the name Rose, carved into the mantelpiece, her finger lingering on the letters. He did not ask questions she could not answer, but his silence was a vessel that could hold her sorrow without breaking. One day, as his leg grew stronger, he followed her out to the graves. She stood as she always did, a silent sentinel of grief. Kuruk did not intrude on her space, but stood a respectful distance away. After a long while, he walked to the base of the pine tree and, using his knife, carved a small, intricate symbol into the bark. It was not the hawk, but something else, a spiral that seemed to turn in on itself and then outward again. He stepped back and looked at his work, then at her. It was an offering, a gesture of respect for her dead that touched her more deeply than any words of comfort could have. His own story remained a mystery, but she gleaned pieces of it. The wounds on his back, he communicated with gestures, were from a mountain lion. But the reason he was alone, an outcast, was a heavier silence. She saw it in the way he would sometimes stare toward the distant mountains, his expression closing off, a shadow of a different kind of loss in his eyes. He was as displaced as she was, a man without a tribe, just as she was a woman without a community. Their shared status as outsiders became another thread binding them together. She started to notice the change in herself. The gnawing emptiness in her chest had not vanished, but it was no longer all-consuming. There was a reason to get up in the morning beyond sheer, stubborn survival. There was a presence to cook for, a quiet voice to listen to, a steady gaze that met hers with respect instead of revulsion. The shorn hair that had been her brand of shame began to feel different under his gaze. He never stared at it with pity or disgust. He simply saw it as part of her, like the color of her eyes or the shape of her hands. In his acceptance, she began to find a sliver of her own. One afternoon, he found her staring at her reflection in a bucket of water, her hand raised to her bristly scalp. The look on her face was one of deep, abiding pain. Kuruk came to stand behind her. He said nothing, but gently took her hand and lowered it. He then lightly touched the top of her head, his fingers tracing the shape of her skull. The touch was not one of possession or pity, but of a strange, profound reverence. It was as if he were blessing the very mark of her humiliation. Cora closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of release. In the eyes of her world, she was a pariah. But in the quiet world of this cabin, in the eyes of this outcast warrior, she was not a witch. She was just Cora, and for now, that was enough. The fragile peace they had built was not destined to last. Redemption was a town that fed on suspicion, and Cora's continued seclusion was a source of festering gossip. She had not been seen buying supplies for weeks, an absence that stoked the embers of their fear. Preacher Amos, a man whose piety was a cloak for his own cruelty, saw her defiance in her survival. A witch, he reasoned, did not need the town. A witch drew her sustenance from darker sources. The discovery came on a Tuesday. The day was sweltering, the air thick and still. Cora had sent Kuruk, whose limp was now barely noticeable, to check the snares she had set by the creek. She was outside, weeding the garden, when she heard the telltale rattle of a wagon approaching. Her stomach plunged. It was Jed, the blacksmith's boy, sent out to deliver a message, or, more likely, to spy. She saw the boy's eyes widen as he took in the sight behind her. Cora turned slowly. Kuruk was emerging from the line of trees, 2 rabbits dangling from his hand. He stopped dead, his body instantly alert, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt. For a long, terrible moment, the 3 of them were frozen in a tableau of silent shock. The boy, Jed, let out a strangled cry, his face pale with terror. He scrambled back onto the wagon, whipping the mule into a panicked retreat. He did not need to look back. The image was burned into his mind, the witch of redemption, living openly with a savage. Cora and Kuruk looked at each other. There was no need for words. The sanctuary was breached. The world they had so carefully constructed within the 4 walls of the cabin had been shattered. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in Cora's belly. She knew what was coming. It was not a matter of if, but when. "They will come," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Kuruk's gaze was hard, his eyes fixed on the cloud of dust kicked up by the retreating wagon. "I know." He walked past her into the cabin, his movements economical and purposeful. He checked the edge on his knife. He tested the strength of the door. He was no longer a patient. He was a warrior preparing for a fight. The rest of the day passed in a state of agonizing suspense. The air grew heavy, pregnant with the coming storm, both in the sky and from the town. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Cora found herself unable to settle. She paced the small cabin, her hands twisting in the fabric of her apron. She looked at Kuruk, who sat with a preternatural calm, his senses seemingly extended to the world outside, listening. His stillness unnerved her, but it also anchored her. The fear was still there, a living thing inside her, but it was different now. It was no longer the paralyzing dread of a lone victim. It was the sharp, clarifying fear of someone who had something to protect. She looked at Kuruk, his strong back, the quiet dignity of his posture. He had come into her life as a burden, a danger. Now, the thought of them taking him, of him being harmed because of her, was unbearable. As dusk began to settle, painting the plains in shades of orange and blood red, they heard it. The sound of many horses, of angry, determined voices carrying on the wind. Kuruk rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion. He moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. "Amos," he said. He had learned the preacher's name from her bitter ramblings. He did not need to say more. Cora went to stand beside him. She saw them, a dark mass of a dozen men on horseback, led by the preacher, who held a torch aloft. The flickering light cast his face in demonic relief, his mouth a hard, unforgiving line. Others held rifles, their barrels glinting in the firelight. This was not a warning, it was a posse. An execution squad. Which? Preacher Amos's voice boomed across the clearing, thick with self-righteous venom. "You harbor a heathen, a murderer. We saw him. The devil provides for his own. Cast him out, or we will burn you out with him." Cora's blood ran cold. She saw the faces in the crowd, men she had known her whole life. Men whose children she had watched grow, whose wives she had shared pleasantries with before the fever came and turned them all into monsters. They were a mob, their individual fears and prejudices forged into a single, unthinking weapon. Kuruk moved away from the window and stood in the center of the room. He looked at Cora, his dark eyes holding hers. In his gaze, there was no fear, only a question. He would fight. He would die here if he had to, but he was looking to her. This was her home, her battle. Something inside Cora shifted. The terrified woman who had been held down in the dirt and shorn like a diseased sheep was gone. The grief-stricken widow who sat numbly by the graves was gone. In their place stood someone new, someone forged in the quiet crucible of the last few weeks. She had been called a witch, an outcast, a devil woman. She had been stripped of her husband, her child, her dignity, her very hair. They had left her with nothing, and in doing so, they had taken away her fear of losing anything more. She walked to the door, her hand resting on the wooden latch. Her heart was hammering, but her mind was icily calm. She looked back at Kuruk. "Stay behind me," she said, her voice low but steady. He gave a slow nod, his expression unreadable but for the fierce loyalty burning in his eyes. She took a deep breath, unlatched the door, and stepped outside to face them. The torchlight flickered, making the night dance with menacing shadows. The dozen men on horseback formed a grim semicircle around her cabin, their faces a mixture of fear and hateful certainty. Preacher Amos sat foremost, his torch held high like a righteous standard. He looked down at Cora, his expression one of pure contempt for this small, defiant woman with her boyish crop of hair. "The time for hiding is over, woman," Amos bellowed, his voice echoing in the unnerving quiet. "You have defiled this land and your home with a red-skinned devil. Send him out now, and we may yet persuade the Lord to have mercy on your soul." Cora stood on her own threshold, her small frame silhouetted against the dim light of the cabin. For a moment, The sheer force of their collective hatred threatened to overwhelm her. She felt the phantom scrape of the shears against her scalp, the memory of their hands holding her down. But then she felt a presence at her back, the steady warmth of Kuruk standing just inside the doorway, and a new strength flowed through her. "There is no devil here, preacher," she said, her voice clear and carrying, devoid of the tremor she had expected. "There is only a man who was wounded and who I helped. Is that what your God condemns? An act of mercy?" A murmur went through the riders. Her directness, her refusal to cower, was not what they had anticipated. "Mercy," Amos scoffed, his face twisting. "You show mercy to a serpent, and it will bite you. He is of a godless people, murderers and thieves. You have chosen his company over your own kind. You have chosen darkness over light." He spurred his horse a step closer. "We will not suffer a witch and her familiar to live among us. Give him up." Just then, Kuruk stepped out of the cabin to stand beside her. He moved with a quiet grace that was more intimidating than any overt threat. He was unarmed, save for the knife at his belt, but he stood as if he were an army of one. His gaze was not on the preacher, but swept over the other men, meeting each of their eyes for a brief, penetrating moment. He assessed them, dismissed them. His silent confidence was a stark contrast to their loud, blustering rage. Several of the men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, their grip on their rifles tightening. "See," Amos roared, pointing a trembling finger. "He stands with her, ready to do her bidding. We must cleanse this place." He began to dismount, his intent clear. The others prepared to follow suit. The moment tightened, stretched thin and brittle, ready to snap into violence. But then Cora did something no one expected. She took a step forward, placing herself directly in front of Kuruk, shielding him with her own body. "No," she said, her voice ringing with an authority she did not know she possessed. "You will not touch him. You will not touch this house. You accuse me of witchcraft? Look at yourselves. You ride in the night, filled with hate, ready to kill a man you do not know, and a woman whose only crime was to grieve. Who are the godless ones here?" She turned her head, her eyes finding the faces of men she knew. "Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice sharp, "I helped your wife with her birthing fever. Mr. Shaw, I gave you the salve that saved your horse's leg. Did I ask for payment? Did I practice any dark arts then, or was I just a neighbor?" The men looked away, their certainty wavering under her direct gaze. She was no longer just the town witch. She was Cora Prescott, reminding them of a time before their fear had curdled into poison. Amos, seeing his power over the mob begin to fray, raised his torch higher. "Lies, deceit, the devil's tongue is silver." It was then that Kuruk moved. He did not draw his knife. He did not make a sound. He simply stepped forward, moving to stand beside Cora again. He reached out, his hand moving slowly, deliberately, so no one would mistake the gesture for an attack. He placed his hand not on her, but on the rough-hewn doorframe of the cabin. Then he looked at Amos, and finally he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that cut through the preacher's ravings. He spoke in his own language, a short, rhythmic phrase. The words were incomprehensible to the townsmen, but their meaning was delivered with the force of a physical blow. It was a declaration. Then he did something even more profound. He turned his gaze to Cora. In front of the armed mob and their furious leader, he slowly, gently, reached out and touched her head. His fingers brushed over the short, rough stubble of her hair, the symbol of her deepest shame. He did not recoil. His touch was not fleeting. It was a firm, possessive, and deeply reverent gesture. He looked from her hair back to the men, his expression a cold, hard vow. The men of redemption did not understand the Apache words, but they understood the language of a warrior's claim. They understood the unwavering promise of violence in his eyes if they were to harm what he protected. He had not touched her like a possession to be owned, but like a sacred thing to be defended. He had taken her shame and held it up as if it were a crown. A heavy, confused silence fell over the group. This was not the scene they had imagined. There was no cowering witch, no snarling savage. There was only a man and a woman, standing together against the world, their strength drawn from one another. Amos sputtered, his face purpling with rage, but his words were lost. The momentum was gone. One of the men, Callahan, slowly lowered the barrel of his rifle. He looked at Cora, a flicker of deep shame in his eyes, before turning his horse and riding away into the darkness. Another followed, then another. The mob, no longer a single entity, dissolved back into individual men with their own doubts and their own consciences. Soon, only Preacher Amos was left, his torch sputtering, his righteousness extinguished. He stared at Cora and Kuruk, his face a mask of thwarted hatred. He spat on the ground, a final, impotent gesture of defiance, before yanking his horse's head around and galloping back toward the empty promises of his town. The night was suddenly quiet again, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind. Cora stood trembling, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her weak-kneed. Kuruk's hand was still on her head, a warm, solid weight that anchored her to the earth. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears in the dim starlight. He had not saved her by fighting. He had saved her by honoring her. He finally lowered his hand, his gaze softening as he looked at her. He had claimed her, not as his property, but as his to protect. He had declared her sacred. And in that moment, under the vast, indifferent sky, Cora Prescott knew she was no longer an outcast. She had found her tribe. It was a tribe of two. The dawn that followed was unlike any other. It broke clean and sharp, washing the plains in a soft, forgiving light. The confrontation had not ended in fire and blood, but in a profound and irrevocable shift. The threat from the town had been repulsed, but both Cora and Kuruk knew it was a temporary victory. The root of the hatred was still there, and it would grow back. Redemption was no longer a home, not even a prison. It was a place they had to leave behind. They moved through the morning in a shared, unspoken understanding. There was no debate, no discussion. Their future was not in this place. While Cora packed what little she could, a few cooking pots, Walter's spare coat, the small box containing Rose's baby blanket, and the single doll Kuruk was outside, preparing for their journey. He fashioned a travois from 2 long poles and a stretched hide, a simple conveyance to carry their meager belongings. He filled their canteens at the well, his movements efficient and certain. When Cora emerged from the cabin, a canvas sack in her hand, she paused on the threshold. She looked back into the small, dim room that had held the entirety of her life, the joy, the grief, the terror, and the unexpected healing. It was a tomb of a past life, but it had also been a cocoon. She was leaving a part of herself here, the broken part. Kuruk watched her, allowing her the moment. He understood the silent farewell. When she finally pulled the door shut, the sound was one of finality. She did not look back again. Her last stop was the pine tree. She knelt between the 2 mounds of earth, her hand resting on the packed soil where her daughter lay. The agonizing hollowness was still there, a permanent fixture of her soul, but it was no longer an all-consuming void. Kuruk had not filled it, no one ever could, but his presence had built a life around it, allowing her to carry the loss instead of being buried by it. "Goodbye, my love," she whispered to the silent ground. "Goodbye, my sweet Rose." She stood, her gaze lingering on the spiral symbol Kuruk had carved into the tree, a guardian mark for the spirits of her family. She felt a sense of peace, a belief that they would not be alone. She turned to Kuruk, who stood waiting patiently by the loaded travois. His eyes held a quiet compassion. He knew the cost of this departure. He, too, had left a world behind. He offered her a water skin, a simple gesture that said, "I am here. We will face this together." They set off toward the west, away from the rising sun, their backs to the town of redemption. Cora walked beside Kuruk, who pulled the travois. They did not speak of a destination. The destination was simply away. It was a place not on any map, a place they would have to create for themselves. For the first time, the vast, open land did not feel like a threat, but like a promise. It was a blank page on which they could write a new story. As they walked, the sun warmed her head. She raised a hand to the short, soft fuzz of her new hair. It had been a mark of shame, a brand of her otherness. Now, it felt like a symbol of a beginning. Everything had been stripped away, and now everything was new. Days turned into a week. They traveled in a comfortable silence, punctuated by the quiet lessons of the trail. He taught her how to read the tracks of animals, how to find water where none seemed to exist. She taught him more English words, and they shared stories around the small campfires they built each night. He told her of the mountains he came from, of a disagreement with his war chief that had led to his exile. He spoke of honor and tradition, and she understood that his loneliness ran as deep as her own. One evening, as they sat watching the stars emerge in the infinite dark, she asked him what he had said to the men from the town. He looked into the fire, his face illuminated by the flames. "I told them she is Shidine, my woman, and that this ground she stands on is holy ground because of it. To touch her is to ask for death." Cora absorbed his words, the truth of them settling deep within her. He had not merely defended her, he had elevated her. He had seen the worth in her when she could not see it in herself. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He reached across the fire and took her hand. His palm was calloused and strong, her hand small within it. It was not a gesture of passion, but of profound connection, a sealing of their unspoken pact. "We are the same," he said softly. "The world has cast us out, so we will make our own world." And in that moment, Cora knew she had found her home. It was not a cabin or a plot of land. It was in the steady gaze of an outcast warrior, in the shared silence under a canopy of stars, in the resilient, stubborn hope for a future they would build together, one step at a time, into the vast and welcoming wilderness. They were two broken pieces, scarred by their pasts, who had found in each other a way to become whole again.